This is the Future of Cybercrime podcast, a new show dedicated to helping security practitioners on the front lines of defending their organization from the cybercrime underground. I'm your host, Zaira Prezado, former Gartner analyst, information security and risk strategist, and storyteller. Now, let's jump right into today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Future of Cybercrime podcast, where we talk about the cybercrime underground. Thanks for listening in today and for watching. As you might tell, we have now moved to video. So this is our first video podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Harlan Carvey. Harlan is a senior incident responder at Huntress with over 20 years in the cybersecurity industry. His accomplishments include 9 published works, one of which is the first book of its kind regarding analysis of the Windows registry. And he's also an accomplished public speaker, an innovative researcher, and a very engaged analyst. Actually, the reason we got in touch is because Harlan engaged with the Future of Cybercrime podcast. And he's always so very prolific in the best way on LinkedIn regarding this field. So thanks for chatting with me today, Harlan.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, before we get started, I know I've missed a few things. So why don't you tell us all a little bit more about yourself and your background and what you do?
So I started out in the military, and I don't usually talk about that because it's pretty much irrelevant. But I know that there's probably more than a few of your viewers that are either recently transitioned military veterans or soon to be transitioned military veterans. And that's a group that I engage with quite a bit, assisting with mentoring and basically helping them overcome the imposter syndrome. So I started out in the military and I transitioned in 1997. I went directly into vulnerability assessments and was having a great time doing that kind of work. And then at a certain point, we started having customers. We would tell them, hey, you've got this vulnerability and it's trivial to take advantage of it. And they started asking the tough questions like, well, has anybody done that? And that's what transitioned me into digital forensics and incident response. And as I moved in that direction, I started to see that a lot of my background from the military, a lot of the on-the-job training, boots on the ground kind of experiences that I had served me extremely well when performing digital forensics and incident response, especially the incident response component. There was an advantage in that I had a lot of background and I'm going to say training in experiences in dealing with different types of individuals that were non-technical but under pressure. And also there was an advantage that my military background offered, which was a lot of the individuals that I was engaging with were also veterans as well. And so there was sort of a built-in kind of rapport that went on there. You know, I started out doing the on-site response where you back up a Ryder truck, and if they've got 3,000 servers, then we're going to image 3,000 servers and take all the data. The old school way of doing it. And we moved into triaging, and then we moved into the use of EDR tools, either already deployed or deploying them as part of the incident response. So what's been really interesting to me to see over the past 2.5 decades to see the transition that we've gone from the original sort of on-site collect full images all the way into what we're doing now to include a decoupling of the DF and IR components and separating those into separate individuals because they are distinct skill sets. I think what a lot of organizations have found is that, hey, we've got some people that are really good at digital forensics and we've got some people that are really good at incident response. We just don't have anybody that's really good at both together. So by decoupling those, we start to see things like, and this is a great benefit for folks that are either looking to transition into cybersecurity or transition within cybersecurity itself, is that by decoupling those two, they've opened up opportunities. So
Okay.
Now you can be an incident responder, but I don't know that much about digital forensics, but that's okay because we've decoupled the DF from the IR.
So a few things you've said there. We can move on to other questions, but I'd like
Sure.
to bring light to something. In the cybersecurity industry, I do frequently see people who served in the military now in leadership positions there in the industry. And I find the transition still an easy one for a lot of people today. Where are the commonalities?
Well, I think there's not so much commonalities as much as advantages. I mean, you've got the life experience, you've encountered the work environment, but under perhaps more stringent or more austere environment. So you didn't have the same things available to you. I mean, we got to think about it. If you're doing logistics, for example, there's a difference between doing logistics, for deployed in a foreign country than there is in doing logistics here in the US for, Sears Roebuck. or something like that. So working in an austere environment and being able to know what information you need to make those decisions and making those decisions, operating in a completely different environment and then moving into the private sector, I think, there are some similarities, but I think there was also some advantages. Hey, look, I've not only got, I've got more, which is something we encounter when we leave the military. I've got more trucks, I've got more people, I've got more this, I've got more technology. I have more information available to me to make the decisions. So you not only have more, but you're used to operating in not just with less, but in a more austere environment. So I think that's an advantage and experience that we bring.
A great advantage. I was thinking about the technical language, technical capabilities you have to learn as well in cybersecurity, and how challenging that is for some people to conceive of moving from their industry into cybersecurity. And was that a challenge for you? Is that continuously a challenge for anyone serving today? I mean, I know now there's a big focus on cybersecurity, but maybe in your time in the transition, was that a hurdle? Was that a difficulty?
It was at first. It was at first. But I think that one of the advantages of, just life experience and having worked before is you suddenly you realize that there are certain things that some people are saying that are important. And they're saying it with, they're enunciating, they're saying it emphatically. But then you realize that within the overall scope, is it really that important?
Oh.
When I first got out of the military, and I completed graduate school before leaving the military, I worked with a young man on our team that was constantly talking about recompiling his Linux kernel. It's all he could talk about. And I was like, oh man, I'm never going to be able to keep up with this guy technically. Well, I quickly realized that what he was doing is a complete waste of time.
How was that?
Why are you constantly recompiling your kernel? What's the reason? And he couldn't articulate it. It was just something he did. It's like, are you adding new drivers? Are you adding new components? Are you adding, are you taking a video card out, putting a new one in? No. What was the reason why we're doing this? And so it was very important to him, even though he couldn't articulate why it was important. It was just something he needed to do.
That's such a common problem today. This is
really?
general.
Is it?
We need to take a risk-based perspective. We need to, a lot of things. And you're like, well, how do you intend on doing that?
Here's a great perspective. We were doing, and some of your listeners could probably go right to Google, but we were doing war dialing at the time. So imagine a Windows-based laptop with a modem in it. We were basically scanning phone systems and, waiting for the receiver on the opposite end to pick up and then trying to determine, is this a fax machine? Is it does a person answer because it's a phone, or is this a modem plugged into the back of a computer? So why was he recompiling his Linux kernel? We weren't using Linux. So I initially came into the role as like, okay, this person is really technical. They're doing things I don't understand. I'm not sure of the terminology. I'm not sure what they're doing. And, within a couple of weeks, I was realizing, well, that's a complete waste of time. We use Windows. We use THC scan and tone lock as our tools. They're all Windows based. And then you begin to see it's like, well, wait a minute. He's spending time recompiling his kernel. But when you read his reports, it's like, they're scribbled in crayon. You initially get over that imposter syndrome when you take a good solid look at, based on your experiences, because you've done this multiple times before, as a member of the military, you're constantly moving around and transitioning. So you go to boot camp as the first experience, then you move on to your next school, then you move on to in the Marine Corps, the Fleet Marine Force, and you're constantly the new guy. Anytime you move to a new unit, you're the new guy. So you've got to learn. And so you're used to developing the thought process of understanding what's important here. Is somebody trying to pull my leg? Are they sending me on a snipe hunt? Or is this something that's really, really valuable that we need to do? And, I think the military in some aspects has really taken a lot of the need for that out because of commonality and training. But still, when you go to a different unit, you're going to run into that. Everybody does something a little bit differently. So you have that in your background. And so when you transition, this is already part of your thought process.
All right. Thinking quick, thinking smart, thinking through the fluff. That's what I'm hearing from you. It's
seeing through the smoke, seeing through the fluff, understanding that what somebody says, is this actually important to the job, or is it just important to you?
That kind of discernment is it's a character trait. Mm-hmm. Someone has to have that. Yeah. Someone has to have that.
But it's a learned skill too.
Yeah. Yeah. And the willingness to learn that is a big thing, or you're just going to end up saying the same terminology all the time.
Right. But it serves that same thought process, if you really think about it, as an incident responder, it serves profoundly well, because you walk into a new environment. In 20 years of doing incident response, I never walked into an environment that I was familiar with, and you never will. You can have the same computers, the same networks, the same switches and routers, and same everything, but it's going to be different because it's different people. So everything's going to be different. It's a different political environment. It's a different societal environment. It's a different technical environment. So you have to be able to adjust as an incident responder. And so having that in your background, having already learned that multiple times, you come in with that mindset and you're saying, okay, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to look at what's important, and I'm going to apply it to the template of I'm here to do incident response. I'm a consultant. This is what I do. I'm here to provide this service to my customer. And that's how we're going to do it. So you just process through that information.
Well, that sounds like, I think, a very valuable skill for a lot of folks.
Very much so. Yeah.
That's it. So let's talk about the state of the cybercrime threat intelligence world today. How would you describe it? Let's leave it to you and your devices to answer that from the perspective of an attacker and a perspective of an incident responder.
Let me preface this by saying that my perspective is boots on the ground. Now, like you mentioned at the beginning, I have listened to a couple of the podcasts that you've had. And I see that there's various levels of individuals, you've had academics. And I come from a very boots on the ground practitioner type of perspective. I often thought that I should wear a t-shirt when I went on incident response that says, I obviate compliance. Because regardless of how you answer the compliance questionnaire, I know the truth. I see the logs, I see the registry. I know how it's set,
Don't be in the room with the auditor.
Right.
Unless you have a good poker face.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry. I have to leave because I'm going to laugh out loud. I'm sorry. So the state of cybercrime intelligence or cyber threat intelligence, it's a component within the overall approach to defense, if you will. Offense, obviously, as well. But from my perspective, to defense. You incorporate SOC analysts, DFIR analysts, all want to incorporate threat intelligence where it's possible to do so, because it makes our jobs more efficient. We can get a completer view faster if we're able to use that threat intelligence. Unfortunately, I think that in too many cases, we're still have too many self-inflicted silos, if you will. Some organizations that have threat intelligence capabilities are completely separate and distinct business units from incident response.
Do you mind explaining that for everyone?
Sure. So I'm an incident responder. I'm going to go on site and I'm going to see something I've never seen before. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to likely want to get some threat intelligence. And I've had incidents where I've gone on where I've been able to call back to the office and say, hey, do we have any intelligence on this? I'm going to send you some hashes or some file names, or even I'm going to send you this file. So we have any threat intelligence around this at all, like a threat actor group or anything else associated with this, that'll point me to where to look for things like other artifacts, persistence mechanisms, things like that. So I'm going to use that information to leverage my work. But look at the sources that we get from some threat intelligence sources. It's some threat intelligence organizations focus solely on open sources. So they'll look at other open reporting and they'll go through VirusTotal. But how much information are they actually getting from incidents, like from actual incident investigations? How much are they able to feed back that value? So let's say, for instance, I'm on an incident response and the threat intelligence team has some information, but it's not the result, for whatever reason, it's not the result of an actual incident investigation. So they give me some information. And then what I should be doing is saying, you know what? I gave you this file, you analyzed it, and you gave me information around that file, not metadata from the file necessarily, but other threat intelligence information about things like persistence mechanisms, or this is associated with this group and that we've seen this group do X, Y, and Z. That's great. It helps me out. But I see something different. When I actually dig into the data itself, I see something different. So what I should be doing is I should be sharing that back. Hey, this is your intelligence right now. I found something different. I should be sharing it back so that that threat intelligence group is able to say, okay, what we see here is a completely different threat actor group, or we see the threat actor group modifying their TTPs. That's what should be happening across the board. And I'm not I'm not saying it's 100%, but across the board, generally speaking, we don't have that in our culture. We don't have the culture where digital forensic analysts are digging in and developing things like, hey, this incident happened at your organization. Here's the things you can do to protect yourself. Here's detections. I'm going to take data from this customer who didn't have our EDR tool. And I'm going to take the data and I'm going to produce from that data, I'm going to produce detections that we then deploy into our SOC. So I'm going to work with the detections engineers to develop new detections based on this information or higher fidelity detections. We don't have that as part of our culture because it's not part of our business model. And I think more importantly, well, what does the customer want? Remember, all of this is all driven by money.
Yeah.
So what is the customer going to pay for? When you do an incident response engagement, the customer is not paying you to develop detections to protect somebody else. The customer is paying you to perform that incident response engagement and provide answers to them.
All right. Well, let's go back to the initial problem we spoke about,
Sure.
which is a feedback loop. What would you do to make that feedback loop better and then the intelligence collection a better process? Because it seems like the problem you discussed, we have threat intelligence analysts that are flirting around the perimeter of a problem, whereas you're saying, no, this is the source of it. It's right there in the center. This is a problem. Work with the problem I've given you, and everyone's giving you just information that's around that problem that doesn't really speak to the problem. So why that? Why that to begin with?
Well, that's because that's how the business is set up. In some organizations, not all, but in some organizations, the incident response team is a completely separate business unit. They've got their own metrics. They've got their own processes. They may not be like at the boots on the ground level. They may not be tightly integrated with, say, a SOC or with threat intelligence. Now, that doesn't mean they won't go out and look for threat intelligence. They won't have access to, they might have access to an internal portal where they can say, well, I've got this hash, and instead of going to virus total, I'm going to dump this hash on the internal portal and see if there's anything there. But who's populating the portal? Who's populating the data source behind that? Are other incident responders populating that? Like, hey, this hash is associated with these other elements of artifact constellations. It's associated with this file, and it's associated with these persistence mechanisms, and this other data, for example. Are we populating it as a result of the incident responders and forensic analysts, or is that being populated by external sources? Open reporting, virus total, or analyzing files extracted from virus total. We see a lot of organizations that are publishing open reporting that say, hey, we were doing our due diligence and looking for new items being posted to virus total. I mean, that's a lot of folks don't really pay attention to that kind of statement at the beginning of open reporting, but that really tells us a lot about the data source itself.
Yeah. Look, this is a humongous problem because now we're not
Is it?
the organization itself.
Well, is it a problem though? Because there's businesses that exist. And when we say businesses exist, there's businesses out there that make money and have made money and will continue to make money based on this business model.
Oh, it depends on the objective.
Yes.
Well, let's speak to what I would think is an objective with integrity. So perhaps that's just my personal perspective over here. The objective with integrity is that there should be stronger collaboration and communication among these teams. So I ask you then, how would an organization build that?
Let me ask you this. Who's going to pay for it?
Yeah.
No, really, seriously, that's really the question, isn't it?
It is.
Isn't it?
It's so unfortunate and so true at the same time. Give me an ideal world, because perhaps we can go fight for a budget to fit that ideal world for a good reason, a good cause. So what would be ideal in the situation?
Part of the issue with, for instance, the incident response business model specifically is that it's largely based on utilization. I know there's a lot of folks out there that are going to go, no, that's not based on utilization at all. I've been in those organizations, and on our weekly meetings, the first or second slide in the presentation from the managers is, hey, here's the top scores for utilization numbers this week. And you're just like, what? I thought you said it wasn't about utilization. So the question that becomes is, how do you take something that's currently a utilization business model and transition it into something that's more ideal in along the lines of what you're referring to? How do we do that? I guess the real question is do we want to? Does anybody want to? And if you were to say, well, how would we do that? Well, we've done a lot of transitioning over I want to say over the last decade and a half to the SOC. We see SOCs. We're seeing a lot of talk about SOAR or different SOAR-based products, and we hear talk about burnout for SOC analysts. So SOC is SOC analysts or something, or SOCs themselves are sort of in the forefront, and they can incorporate logging through SIMs. They can incorporate EDR or whatever flavor of DR we're talking about, NDR, XDR, whatever we're going to add to it. But it all comes down to basically the same thing. And so if we transition from a completely separate business unit altogether and say, we're going to have this capability out here and we're just going to, we're just going to take calls. We're just going to do incident response. We remove that utilization model and incorporate those analysts, the DFIR analysts, as either a higher tier, higher level analysts within the SOC themselves. So when something is escalated to a certain point, it then crosses a threshold and becomes the purview of the forensic analysts. That's one way to do it. And then we can still serve those individuals that are not SOC customers. We can still do that.
You seem to say, at least in this engagement, that there is a wonderful way where you can actually utilize, be it your insert letter DR tool, but ideally a good EDR tool to actually bring people together within the IR process. So I think that you're giving some just fantastic feedback over there. So let's also then look at how you would summarize the state of cybercrime threat intelligence from the actor's perspective. And what I mean is from the cybercrime actor's perspective.
Well, that's kind of interesting because I've had some insights over the last couple of years based on my various roles. And I have no illusions, okay? I don't have any illusions. I think that as many threat actor categories or threat actor dossiers, whatever term you want to use, that we have at our different cyber threat intelligence groups or units, I think they have the same thing on us. I think they have classifications of defenders, honestly. But I think it's also to various degrees, much like it is on our side. And the reason I say that is because EDR has given us the visibility to see those that just don't care. I've also seen threat actors go into organizations and look for specific EDR tools by name, not just like, hey, give me a dump of all the services on the system. It's, I'm going to dump the services, but I'm going to look specifically for, insert name, CrowdStrike Falcon, Carbon Black, whatever the case may be. They have situational awareness, so they're looking. And so we have to make the assumption that there is a level of situational awareness. One of the things that I've seen that actually started, I believe January of last year is when I became aware of it. Not that that's when it started, was that a lot of the executables that we were seeing come in to organizations were just bloated. And when I say bloated, you have an executable that all the functionality is less than 100 kilobytes. But the file comes in at 600 megabytes or more. Towards the end of that period, if you will, in my role, we were seeing executables that when they got on the system were close to a gigabyte in size.
Wow.
And, knowing about PE file formats and things like that, I started asking questions like, okay, yes, we have the hash and we know that the hash took longer to generate. But let me ask you this. Have you parsed the sections? And do you see like a specific section that is enormously large and just full of junk or just full of zeros? And what we're seeing was one section that was just full of zeros. So the question becomes what's the point of doing this? Look at our own processes. Like for instance, some EDR tools, when they collect executables that are, newly seen executables that are run on systems, they collect a copy. But those tools have a limit to what the size of the file that can be downloaded. So if the limit is set at 25 megabytes and the file that comes in is 600 megabytes, now I have to go back to my engineering staff and request assistance to download that specific executable. And then once I get it, what am I going to do with it? I'm a SOC analyst. Am I going to do malware reverse engineering? No, I'm probably going to upload it onto one of these automated analysis platforms, which have size limits, right? My functionality, my capabilities are inhibited because of the limitations of the tools.
Fairly ingenious. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not saying that this was the intention because, I'm not sitting there with the guy who's doing this or the girl
Yeah.
who's doing this. It could be either one. But what
Smart
I'm
enough
saying,
to be.
what I'm saying is this is the perspective of how it impacts the organization, how it impacts the individual analyst. I can't get a copy of this file because of the limitations of the tool I'm using. I can't upload this file and get the answers I need because of the limitations of the tool I'm using. The threat actor can't modify those limitations, but what he can modify is what's within his scope of control. And if I add an additional 500 megabytes of zeros to an executable, I don't change its functionality.
No.
But I do have an impact on the ability of an individual analyst to determine what's going on here.
That's incredibly brilliant. I know that you're not saying there's anyone who's actually doing that, though I'm not leaving it out of the scope of possibility. I truly think that anyone would. But wow. Well, there we go. That's another perspective on tooling here. We had a really cool one. And then now we have another that says, hey, up your game, because now this is a way to fight back.
So to bring this all back, I do believe, it seems pretty clear that there is at least some level of threat intelligence on the actor side.
There has to be. There's no way.
Exactly.
There's impossibility about there not being that. So this is one good perspective as you start to find. Well, hopefully you'll think about this question even after this, and then start to find what perhaps is a threat intelligence tactic used by many of these groups in some, and then continue to post on those things. I know you already do.
Even going back to NotPetya, for example, in 2017, when we saw the issues where the MBR was damaged and we weren't able to recover, initially recover information, we were able to, the organization I was with at the time had an old school analyst, and we were able to reconstruct the MBRs. But that whole situation just made it absolutely obvious to me what was happening with respect to anti-forensics techniques. So different things are deployed. And I think not just anti-forensics or counter-forensics, but I think the MITRE attack framework refers to some of these techniques as defense evasion, and techniques that are used specifically to inhibit or obviate the analyst's ability to determine the scoping and beyond. And so we hear about things like, clearing event logs. Well, why would you clear event logs? Well, they're a pretty critical source of information for what's happening on the Windows system. Why would you delete these things? Or why would you take this particular tactic or take this particular approach? Well, all of that's because of, hey, this is important to the forensic analyst. So I'm either going to not populate that data source because of the actions I'm taking, or what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that data source from use.
Let's talk about that old school analyst that you mentioned.
He was able to take a few pretty straightforward steps and determine the necessary geometry of the drive to be able to reconstruct the master boot record. And from that, we weren't able to, and we didn't want to, we weren't able to boot the system, but what we were able to do is open it in most forensic viewing tools, for instance, in Case or FTK Imager or something like that. We were able to open it to the point where we were able to dig into it, read the file system, and be able to extract information. So having him around allowed us to do certain things that otherwise we would not necessarily have been able to do, because the tactic that was used at the time was beyond the reach of most of the analysts we had out there. It completely stopped us from what we were doing.
That's big. And that's an old school analyst. What's going on now where that's not a tool set, a skill set?
I think that some of the things that we're seeing now, I've referred to them recently as to what's old is new again. The use of alternate data streams. That's always been very, very interesting to me, going back to, the very early days of NT 3.51. But how many people were around back then that are currently working in the industry? There are some things that, we were used to seeing for the longest time that sort of disappeared from view for whatever reason. Either they weren't used or we just moved on to a role where we weren't looking at them. And then suddenly we see an analyst that's having to learn about them all over again. We see a new analyst, maybe a SOC analyst that's been in the industry for 2 years, or a DFIR analyst who transitioned from another role. I read recently somebody came out of 6 years in cosmetology. Now they're a SOC analyst. And that's great.
That's awesome for them. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah, it's a lot to learn, but it's a lot to learn. So there's always going to be something new. And sometimes those things that they're seeing new for the first time, some of us have seen before. I first was interacting with, I can't say Windows, it's got to be DOS systems like 40 years ago.
You've got time.
And I saw things at the command line that analysts are being presented with today. And they're like, oh, what is that? It's like, really? But it's just, they haven't seen it before. I will be the first one to raise my hand. I haven't seen everything before. It was just September of this year that I realized that I understood that you can use Bits Admin to transfer files over SMB instead of HTTP.
I think we're in a phase where universities should start teaching history of cybercrime courses. Bring up case studies like this. Bring up practitioners who've had experience here so that people can say, oh, I remember that from that one case study. Because why in law and jurisprudence do we have lawyers who remember cases from the 1800s and 1900s in the United States and can go ahead and cite them or crawl through things and say, I remember this one thing because it was just drilled into my head in university and then law school. And then I had to know it for some odd reason for the bar. Why do we have that? And we can't apply that historically in cybersecurity. So maybe
we can. But the problem is, I think the challenge is, and this goes back to a quote from General Mattis, where he said, if you're not reading hundreds of books, you're functionally illiterate. And he also stated that our own personal experiences are not enough to sustain us. And if you apply both of those to the question that you just asked, we just don't have enough people that are writing in cybersecurity. And I mean, writing stuff that can be used in that manner, writing historical looks, writing those types of cases, like writing up those types of cases. I've talked to individuals about some of the stuff that I saw years ago on PCI engagements and how we unraveled things. I've talked to them about it. But do we see these things being written up on a regular basis? Do we see sort of a historical look from an individual? And I was talking to my daughter recently, and she was asking me what types of books I read, what types of things I like to read. And I told her, I said, a lot of times I'm less interested in the high level historian geopolitical view than I am in what's going on from the soldier on the ground.
Wow, very much.
So I like to read
of things.
Right, the practical application, the what's actually happening on the ground. And we don't have enough of that. I believe, in my perspective, we don't have enough of that in cyber, especially in digital forensics.
Okay, message for everybody.
Well, message for everyone, but now I realize it's something I've got to take on. So
you've published a great deal, and I'm more than certain that because this is top of mind for you and it's actually an interest, you'll be one of the greats here.
No, we'll see about that.
I think so.
We'll see about that.
So. All right. Well, let's look at the future then. Zooming out into the future, what do you think the future of the cybercrime underground will look like? And let's quantify this. Let's take a year out. And then if you can go any further, you let me know.
I don't generally like to prognosticate. I don't like to make predictions. I think for a lot of reasons, we're going to continue to see the same things we do because of the silos that we have. I want to say it's self-inflicted, but it's not really. When you really, really think about it, business units and business models are exactly that. They're about businesses. And what are businesses driven by? Businesses are driven by money, which comes from customers. So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing isn't, as we see as limitations within the industry aren't going to change until either somebody makes the investment or a customer comes along and says, you know what, this ain't working for me.
It's hard to get around that. It's we spoke about at the top of the call.
Yeah.
Incentivizing the customer to care a lot more to make changes that we would recommend.
So that brings to mind GDPR, for example. When GDPR came out or it was coming out, one of the questions I had in my mind, because I was working in a consulting company that had ties in Europe as well, and customers from Europe, the question was, what's the impact going to be? Are we going to have, more of these coming in because now there has to be reporting, or, is there going to be some other effect, some other impact that we don't realize? For example, are we going to get cases in where somebody says, hey, I'm being hit with this, or I'm being hit with this fine. Can you prove or disprove it? I don't think we ever really saw that I didn't have, as a consultant, I didn't have the full view of what was going on across the organization. I just knew, my little lane and the lanes of those near me that I engaged with. But as we look at changes that are going on in the cyber insurance industry, we've got these exclusions for war that pertain to things like the Ukraine conflict. The thought becomes is, where does that attribution come from? Who makes the attribution? So who decides? So when something happens at a customer, at an individual organization, when something happens and they have insurance, who makes that determination? And then if somebody's going to make the determination, somebody's going to question it because one of the parties, the carrier, the customer themselves, the insured, somebody's going to come out on the short end there. And so somebody's going to ask questions. So what's that going to do? What impact is that going to have on the boots on the ground analyst?
Why include that exclusion requiring attribution when attribution is one of the most difficult problems within this industry? Why include that? Is it because the effect of this act would be so grand that insurance companies don't want to take it on? Is it because they don't want to politicize their own actions? Like, what is this? Why include that as a stipulation? I
can't speak to that. I'm not I don't work in the insurance industry. I don't do the, actuarial data, things like that. But that's a good question. That's a really good question. Maybe this is a result of, and I say maybe because I'm speculating, maybe this is a result of the insurance industry, the pendulum swinging back the other way. Originally, they were allowing for policies for pretty much anything. And maybe now what's happening is, maybe that's run its course. Maybe we're now going to have to take a really hard look at, what's going on. I mean, look at ransomware, with the number of ransomware attacks. And, I say the number of ransomware attacks loosely because, how do we really track that? But the fact of the matter is look, what we don't have insight into is how many claims are being made for cyber attacks that are the result of ransomware. And so when you look at, the impact that this is having, not on the organization, not just on the organizations themselves, but on the insurance industry, then maybe the approach to take is instead of just allowing somebody to have a policy that covers this, which does nothing to protect them, because in order for them to get the payout, as a result of their policy, they have to have been impacted by that attack.
Right.
So it's not preventing anything. Right. So, maybe the insurance industry is looking at going back the other direction, saying, you know what, we're going to put conditions around this now. You have to have this in place. You have to be this tall to ride the ride, or you don't get the policy.
As insurance companies do.
And that makes sense because they even going back, I think it was about 12 years ago, I was talking to senior executives at Kairos Technologies, the folks that actually produce Carbon Black. And their goal when they produced the Carbon Black EDR, their original method of getting it out there was to go to the insurance industry. It didn't work. I'm sure not for the lack of trying, but the industry's changed in the past decade.
Yeah, I can understand the logic behind insurance companies wanting to make sure that they do health checks so that they can maintain a healthy risk response as well.
Well, it's interesting you say that. It's interesting you say that though, because what I don't see, and this ties back to what we're talking about history. What I don't see is the insurance industry learning the lessons that have already been learned by the PCI industry.
Is this because they want to do a make money fast in this industry idea?
I'm not a business leader in the industry. I'm boots on the ground. All I see is that, hey, look, we have these, I see changes in the insurance industry. I see movement and growth in the insurance industry that I saw actively working PCI engagements 15 years ago. I see the same issues. I see, some of the same things happening. So it's like, why didn't we learn from what worked or what didn't work then and apply that now? And given the breadth of access that insurance carriers have, we could potentially have a much greater impact.
Harlan, with the time we have, I can't even dig into it. Will you publish something on this? Please do. Be it a blog post, if even a blog post, a few paragraphs on lessons learned from PCI. insurance
Yeah.
industries, what can you take away?
I think in large part, I'm already viewed as the old wacko sitting out there yelling at the young kids to get off his lawn. So why not just add to that, right?
Add to it. It actually is helpful. It's helpful when people get a little bit more whacked out.
Yeah, I'll
Free yourself.
I'll own that guy. I'll be that guy.
Do it. There's no harm in it. We need a spectrum of intelligence here. So I'll give you just one last question.
Okay.
3 pieces of actionable advice that you'd give to security practitioners that are listening in.
Define your goals before you do anything. Define and understand your goals because that drives everything else. Make sure to validate and verify because too often we're trying to get the easy answer and we don't really validate or verify what we're looking at. Make sure you do that and just keep it simple. There's no need for, I've seen too many analysts over the years trying to write up a report, a ticket, or write up a forensic analysis report. And they're like, how do I say this different? And my response is, why do you need to say it different? Why not just be clear? I think those are my 3 things. Have your goals, validate and verify, keep it simple.
They all carry so much weight.
I hope so.
Simple, but validate, verify. We spoke to some of the issues there.
Yeah.
We spoke to, so everything carries a lot of weight. Those are some big life lessons. Well, unfortunately, and I mean this, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. But before we head out on this call, where can our listeners find you?
I maintain the Windows IR blog on a regular basis. I'm on Twitter as Keita89, and I am easy to find on LinkedIn because I'm the only one with my name.
All right. We'll make sure to provide those links, those sources. Thank you again for your time here, Harlan. I know we've had some
thank you so much
before this. Yeah. Every time I have a good conversation with you, I feel like we've run over our time plus some. So it's really a joy to speak with you. And let's just keep in touch. And I'm excited to get feedback from others.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, all. Thank you for joining into the Future of Cybercrime podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Please come on over back to us every other Thursday. You'll see posts on LinkedIn showcasing what we've got bi-weekly, and we will make sure to keep in touch with you. Reach out. Make sure to just engage with us. This is for you. Thank you all. Take care.